Welcome to Cambridge Forum. We will be discussing Why Doctors Write with author, editor, and physician Danielle Ofri. Rather than asking you to make an opening statement, I'm just going to ask you to answer the big question that we're all here to talk about, which is, how do emotions affect the practice of medicine?
Well, it's an enormous question, and I guess I would start with the analogy of, what do we do when we're sick? And I would say most of us probably turn to our computer first and quickly try and search those symptoms, see if we can find a picture of the rash or description of this ache in that nether part of your body. And often their search can be correct. I mean, there's plenty of snake oil on the internet, but if you search in a reliable place, you might actually find the correct answer. And I think that's what many of us do when a patient asks me a question. I'm often searching it in a database of some sort. But even if that is accurate and even if that's correct, I think few of us would want to be taken care of when we're sick by our computer or our smartphone or any other electronic device, even if it were more accurate than human beings. I think when we're ill, particularly seriously ill, we want to be taken care of by real doctors, actual nurses, live, warm-blooded people. And I think we intuitively get a sense of what the difference that would be. Luckily, and I think medicine remains fundamentally a human endeavor. And whenever two human beings are interacting in any way or form, emotions by necessity weave an underlying network. And so in medicine, when we have a connection between a nurse and a patient or a doctor and a patient, they are two human beings that are flawed, imperfect, and yet somehow perfect for that role in a way that a computer would not be and could not be. And so emotions are part of the equation. They're there like the oxygen that we breathe, like the lights that are on, electricity. It's just part of the interaction. Now, whether we choose to pay attention to them, ignore them, or utilize them for our patient's benefit, at times maybe to our patient's detriment, will change how the interaction goes. But, we think of ourselves as so scientific. We wear crisp white coats and we have this sort of legacy of medicine as a science. But in fact, when we practice medicine, much of what we do, even when we have scientific grounding, that can often be overridden by our own experiences, our own history, our emotions, what we recall, our gut feelings. And so I feel as though it's part of what we exchange between us, and we can ignore them, or we can pay attention and try and use them to the best benefit for our patients.
Okay, now so you're suggesting is that medicine is a little bit of an art. And I want to return to emotions in a minute, but I want to jump to the second big question, which relates to that, which is, why do so many doctors write? We have in this room quite a few doctors who write as well as you. Why are doctors driven to write? Does it have something to do with that?
Well, I mean, there's sort of an epidemic of medical writers these days. It's a little bit of a contagious disease. Well, partly, those of us who are in the medical field in whatever capacity, I mean, stories are what patients tell us. That's what we get the patient's story when we interview them, and that often forms the bulk of how we make diagnosis and even how we offer treatment. We write the medical history it's very formalized, but it is a narrative form. And so I think there's a logic to why stories have an appeal. And, for those of you married to accountants, the stories they bring home at the end of the day, I think, don't quite have the same dramatic appeal as those of you, who come home. I mean, net asset dispersion and fixed cost derivatives, it's not, quite the same as the stories from the hospital or from the clinical practice. There's a human drama that defines medicine in many ways. So I think literature and stories have an intrinsic appeal to people in medicine. And even when they don't talk about life in medicine, I think story and character are so much a part of our daily life, and I think that's what gives us meaning in what we do. I mean, if you look at medical journals, now there are literary columns in so many medical journals, and poems and essays, and sometimes fiction. And so many of my colleagues will freely admit they turn first to the poem or the essay before they see which standard of care has been pummeled by the latest mega trial. And I don't think that that's an accident, because I can't think of a person who entered medicine, because they're interested in Kaplan-Meier curves or quality-adjusted life years. I think all of us enter the field because we're interested in people and taking care of them. And so reading a poem can really relate to how we function daily in the clinical trenches, much more than the clinical trial. Even if it's absolutely clinically relevant and earth-shattering data, that isn't what we see in our daily life. So I think that story part is so attractive to us. And so when we step away from medicine, I think there is a desire to write, and the story format and the poem format fits what we do. And there are obviously people who paint and draw and do other artistic outlets, but I think that writing in particular, there's a long history of medical writers because of the natural resonance of story in your daily life and story as a way to write. So I think it just makes some sense.
So, by the way, anyone who is married to an accountant who wishes to come up to the microphone, maybe feel free to do that too. So what you said is very compelling, but it doesn't account for something really important, which is that many, many doctors don't write. So it is a kind of select group of doctors, although they're proliferating perhaps, that who were driven to write. So tell us a little bit more about that, what you think it is that makes that select group of doctors decide, and maybe use yourself as an example.
I don't think any of the doctoral writers I know set out to become doctoral writers. And maybe there are some out there, but I think most of us stumbled into it. I mean, for me, when I didn't plan to be a writer at all, I went the science and medicine route completely. And after I finished my residency, I trained at Bellevue, and my training coincided with the height of the AIDS epidemic. So it was a very long slog and very exhausting in a deep way. So I decided I need a little time away. So I took a year and a half off without a real plan in mind, and I did locum tenens. I did some temp work for doctors just to pay my student loans that were coming due. And then in between these 4-week stints, I traveled as long as the money would last. And then I'd call my agency, collect from Oaxaca, and say, well, what do you got next week? And then I would do another 4 weeks at some small practice in the Southwest. And for me, I remember the feeling that I wanted to write these stories down. I had the awareness that I had lived through a very compelling and unique time. And I thought I should write them down as it happens. I had a colleague who took notes, and I was envious of her because I knew that never again would I be so intensely involved in such truly high drama. Not that I thought of it as drama, but it was very dramatic, life and death all the time, and vast changes in people's lives. But I think it was just too busy. I mean, someone died or was discharged and the bed was filled in 15, 20 minutes. There really wasn't any physical time, but I think it was too close to the emotional bone to write about it then. There really wasn't any space to process. And so for me, the time away was the first chance to think, to slow down the tape and just think what all these patients meant. And writing down was a way to do that. And writing is so much slower than the experiencing of it, and especially revising. I think we all think about, wouldn't it be great to revise life? Couldn't I rewind the tape and have given the better medication or said the right thing to my spouse, or all these things you'd want to revise, but we don't get that chance. But writing gives you that chance. And so to go back, and while I can't change what happened, I can revise how I think about it, how I settle it. And while I wouldn't say it's a therapy, it has a therapeutic side, but it was the chance to revisit slowly and really contemplate. I mean, medical professionals in general, but doctors in particular, I mean, we walk fast, we talk fast, we write fast, we think fast, usually all at the same time, and we're constantly juggling things at such a rapid speed that there isn't really any space to consider, to contemplate any of what happens. And maybe it's fear, if we want to go back to emotions, that if you actually let it percolate down to what that might redound to or mean, it could be a little scary. So I think part of our fast pace is keeping that reflective silence at bay, because it's a little terrifying to go in there. And so we have a convenient excuse. We're busy people, and we have pagers, and we have patients to see. But I think all of us have a sense there is that space down there that is kind of calling to you, and we'd rather not spend any time there. And writing is one of, and there are many ways to spend some time and look at that, because if you don't place it somewhere, and not that there's any sort of, so-called closure, but just a settling of some of these experiences, they'll be there all the time. And it's hard to move forward when these things are still rattling around in the active brain space. And I think that people in the medical profession find many ways of dealing with that. Some people drink or take drugs. I mean, the rate of drug abuse and alcoholism is very high in medicine. The suicide rate, is amongst the highest. I mean, every day an American doctor takes their life. And that's higher than lawyers and accountants and other professionals, even with similar education. I think because there is a lot of intensity, and we don't have much in the way of institutional outlet for this. And so I think people create their ways, and sometimes it's berating your junior staff, and that's a way of, doing something with that. And sometimes it's an artistic way. And so for me, writing was a way to negotiate with all of that and find, the truce. It wasn't settled, but we came to an agreement that, okay, this can sit here for the time being, and you can keep going back and you can keep revising if you want till it settles.
So, in fact, you've entered a kind of new phase in your writing where you've moved beyond writing about your own experiences and what you've learned directly, and you've begun actually seeking out and interviewing other doctors and medical students, residents, and interviewing them and telling a little bit of their stories, as well as telling deeper stories about some of your patients. So in the new book, for example, you talk about some moments when you were very afraid, but you also tell stories about other doctors who have faced terrible fear or anxiety or depression or any one of a multitude of emotions. So what would you say it's like to kind of turn the lens on someone else, whether it's another doctor or a patient?
I think it's a bit of a relief. I think it takes about 3 books to get kind of through your own stuff. And, again, settle it to a degree, but it keeps reappearing. And, some of the things in the new book are very old things. First year of medical school, first code, first time seeing a patient who smelled bad. And, all these first are still coming back because you never quite get over all of them. And sometimes I've even told the story again because now, after 20 years of being in medicine or working with students who are facing their own first time, I see it a little bit differently. But talking to others has been so eye-opening. And as I was telling some students today at Grand Rounds, when I started this book, I sent out a call for stories. Just tell me stories that made you who you are today as a doctor, created you. And the email kind of went out to friends and friends. So all sorts of people I didn't know responded. And, not one person mentioned the New England Journal of Medicine as what made them the doctor they are. And they didn't talk about either physical diagnosis class or their medical boards or their board certification. They all told these powerful stories that all revolved around a potent emotion. That was the dominant thing. They didn't remember, all the rheumatology differential diagnosis that they'd so dutifully memorized. That was all long forgotten. But these patients stayed with them with a frightening clarity. I mean, they really could remember details of what the people were wearing, what they smelled like. These details were singed, in their memories. And, many of us recertify for our boards every 10 years. And to go back and relearn these facts, it's interesting how hard it is to get random facts to stick, but not hard to have these stories stick with us. They stay so easily because I think they're the essence of what we do. We have some intrinsic, I think, reaction and resonance with story and character, but they did create who we are. And we're different doctors because of those patients, and much less than the school we went to or the facts we learned.
In fact, and sometimes when you tell a patient's story, you get so deep into their emotions and their background, and you've told in Medicine in Translation For example, in the opening piece in that book, you tell a story about a Nigerian patient who was part of your work in the Survivors of Torture program at NYU that is just riveting and terrifying. And when you tell his story, you tell it based on having spent a great deal of time with him, having him tell it to you, and pulling out of it. So you're really giving him voice that he could not have had without your agency. Would you say that's...
Yeah, and because I was, in a sense, writing in real time, which is in contradistinction to writing initially about the past, I asked him, I said to him, could I talk to you outside of the clinic? Because I'd like to write about this, and here's what I do, and he was interested. So then and this isn't a common occurrence, but we sat down separately and talked in depth, and really, and for me, as the writer, but also as his doctor, I learned so much more about him that I couldn't have gotten from our limited 20-minute sessions, no matter how frequent they were, to spend several hours speaking. And I think in an ideal world, if you could spend 3 hours with a patient and delve into their story, you would have such a different understanding, and I think could take much better care of your patient by having that larger, deeper context.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure there are some people here who also wonder about that whole process of telling someone else's story. And there have been a couple of times when you've written about a patient, you've talked to them about whether you might write about them and how they feel about that. And wasn't there one of your patients who had some... Tell that story.
So it was, I think we were putting together incidental findings, and the book was kind of ready to go to press, but I had a really interesting, intriguing patient on the wards who had been admitted. He was found down. He'd fallen in his bathroom, was wedged between the toilet and the bathtub for a couple of days, and they had to break down his door, and he kind of was on the edge of life. He really was run down. His apartment was a hoarder kind of apartment. And he came into the hospital, and he had that wild-eyed look like he's been living on the Bowery. And I never talk about writing with my patients in general. Again, most of my patients don't speak English, and it's not even an issue. But even those who do, I never mention it. And I walk in one day, and I see Singular Intimacies on his bedside table on 16 West at Bellevue. I'm shocked. And apparently a neurology resident was in seeing the patient. They got into a discussion. I guess she brought it up, and she gave him a copy of the book. And he was fascinated. He wanted to talk about writing and this, and he kept talking about, he held all these patents, and he lectured around the world. He was in the Small Business Hall of Fame. And here's this guy who was just sunken cheekbones and scraggly gray beard, and looked for all the world like he was just homeless. And I kept thinking, this is delusional behavior, or maybe he had more of a life, but a clearly unraveled mental illness or drug addiction or abuse, or something happened and put him on the margins of society. I just kind of kept blowing it off. And but I asked him, could I write about you? Write your story. He said, as long as I can read it. And of course, when I first told Helen, she was like, oh, I don't know about that. There's only one editor in this book here. But I did, and he was discharged. He went to rehab for a couple of weeks, and so I finished the piece, and part of what I wrote about in the piece was my impression of him as kind of his life falling apart, but also how rounds were interminable with him. He was really chatty, and you couldn't get out of the room, and and I love to chat. But when you have 40 patients, you gotta make progress to get down the hall before 5 p.m. And so getting out was so hard. He always would ask these unanswerable questions, so I finally mustered my courage, and I called him at the rehab, and I asked, so what did you think? And I really thought that he would be most upset by my intimations that his life had fallen apart. Because when I did Google him, he actually had been in the Small Business Hall of Fame, believe it or not, but obviously not now. This was quite a prior life. But that didn't bother him. He didn't mention that at all. What he was most upset about was my physical description of him. His gaunt look, and I think I used the term the soul-battering illness, and he said, did I really look like that? And I said, yeah, you did. And for me, that was the most objective part. My speculations were something else, but that was what he looked like. And I think I'd held this mirror to him that he had never seen, and it was very upsetting for him to see how he looked. And then he was upset about the part about taking so long in his room, and I kind of took that out. I remember he said, "Oh, you're taking out all the fire. Put that." But I realized that I had to. My duty was really to him. If it made him uncomfortable, I couldn't put it in. But then the book got published, and we gave a reading at the West Side Y, and I invited him. He's on the Upper West Side. And he shows up to the reading in like this nice navy blue sport coat and this silver-tipped cane. His hair is dyed black again, striding in, beard trimmed, and he held the mirror up for me. Like, I had not seen him in this prior life, and I simply assumed who I saw on the ward, that was the definition of him, and it wasn't. And he really forced me, as I forced him to see what he couldn't see, he forced me to see what I couldn't see. So it was a unique experience where it really was a double-sided mirror for both of us.
It's a wonderful piece, too. I'm going to give you warning that I'm going to be opening up the floor for questions in just a few minutes. Before that, I'm going to ask Danielle if she will read a little piece, because we were talking just a minute ago about fear and about your own experiences and writing out your own experiences. And it reminded me of a passage you have in this new book about the first time you went to a cove. And I think that if you would just read that little piece, I think it would give everyone a sense of how visceral this is. And before you do that, I am going to remind our audience that you are listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of Why Doctors Write with Dr. Danielle Ofri. So would you read a passage for us?
The stat cardiac arrest page came through in my beeper. Code 411, airway team, MICU stat. This was it, the first code I was in charge of. After 2 years of racing to codes as a first and second year resident, buoyed by the excitement of dramatic action, thrilled to be part of a team, secure in the knowledge that the medical consult would be directing the show, now suddenly the code was mine. I was the medical consult. I was the one to call the shots, direct the care, assign the jobs, to make the decisions. I had been on the medical consult service for less than a week. I've been privately counting on 30 days elapsing, with every last coronary artery in the hospital capaciously wide open, every lung of Vialis buoyant with oxygen, every blood clot obediently self-dissolving. But this strategy was evidently not working as I'd hoped. Here it was, my first code. Shit. I slapped my hands against the overloaded pockets of my white coat to keep the tools and cards and pocket guides from spilling out while I raced to the medical intensive care unit. I burst into the MICU, breathless, throat parched to Saharan levels, pulse bounding powerfully enough to detonate the collar of my shirt, and glanced wildly about the unit. There was the crowd huddled around bed 5. I loped over and pressed through the bodies, angling toward the head of the bed. "I'm med consult," I announced, gamely smoothing out the jitteriness in my voice. And then my brain splintered into complete and utter blackness. A resident began feeding me the facts. 72-year-old guy, diabetes, coronary disease, stroke last year, admitted with pneumonia, developed allergic reaction to antibiotics, subsequent renal failure, transferred to the MICU 3 days ago for congestive heart failure, spiked a fever last night, now unresponsive, BP 70 over palps, ready pulse, or something like that. The truth was, I couldn't have told you the details 20 seconds later, much less 20 years later. Everything he said sloshed into the primordial neuronal soup that was now the condition of my gray matter. "Say something," I implored myself, "anything." "Chest compressions," I forced out. "Keep bagging the oxygen. Get a line in. EKG." Well, any idiot knows the basics for keeping someone alive, but what next? I couldn't seem to remember anything from those ACLS training courses. All those protocols had seemed so logical then, so ridiculously simple on those ever-forgiving mannequins, but now there was someone real, someone alive, though perhaps not for much longer with me at the helm, and I couldn't unknot a single protocol. Did you shock first or give epi first, or was epi only for a systole algorithm, or should I be doing the pulseless VTAC algorithm, or the PEA, or the VFib algorithm? Someone finally pressed an EKG into my hand. The presence of something actual, something physical in my hand, brought a brief, mollifying reprieve. These would be my tablets handed down from the mount. The talismanic markings would allow me to divine the answer and jumpstart my fear-stricken brain. I stared at the EKG and stared, and I squinted at the zigs and the zags, but they seemed to melt into a Sanskrit-like jumble. Think, I demanded, think! All those exhortations from my professors about approaching the EKG methodically, about systematically examining the rhythm, the rate, the axis, the P waves, these lessons evaporated in the cold shudder of reality. Think, I screamed to myself. Okay, the T waves, maybe they looked a little peaked. Peaked T waves were indicative of elevated potassium levels, except when they weren't, and except when they looked peaked but weren't actually peaked. They did sort of look peaked, I thought to myself, but maybe they were just hyperacute T waves, or maybe they were enlarged from early repolarization, or maybe they were just big. I was too terrified to trust myself on anything. I could order the treatment for hyperkalemia if those peak T waves were real, but I was too scared that I might be wrong. What if I injected intravenous calcium for hyperkalemia that wasn't actually there and then really screwed things up? Who's in charge here anyway? Barked a new voice. My body seized up tighter, if that was even possible. A cardiology fellow blustered his way into the crowd, clearly seeing the mess for what it was. I looked up and made a vague indication that I was running the code. There was an embarrassing moment as the fellow and I instantly recognized each other. Mitchell had been my medical school classmate. We spent the first 2 years of med school together and were even friends. But because the years I'd taken out to do a PhD, he completed his medical training before me and was now a cardiology fellow while I was a medical resident. It was evident that if he hadn't known me from med school days, he would have dressed down the med consult for not running the code more aggressively. He bit back his comment, sidled over to me, and leaned in to look at the EKG. Peak T waves, hyperkalemia, he announced clearly, though not derisively, an act of humanity that I'll never forget. Let's get some calcium, he said, amp of bicarb, D50, and an insulin. The patient did all right in the end, or at least survived the code, which was pretty much what we considered success in the MICU. I slunk off after the patient stabilized, hoping to disappear myself in the sea of white coats shuffling off to rounds. I was furious at myself for getting so paralyzed by fear that I could barely run the code. What had happened to all my training? All the codes I participated in, all the books and lectures I'd been learning from? What made me the angriest at myself, though, was that I'd actually gotten it right. It was hyperkalemia. The T waves absolutely had been peaked. I could have called it on the spot and been the model of a take-charge resident, as a med consult running a code is supposed to be. But I couldn't get beyond my gripping fear of the situation, of getting it wrong, of killing the patient, of looking like an idiot.
So emotions do impact the practice of medicine, clearly. We're seeing that through your writing, and I think we're seeing that every time any one of us has an encounter with a medical professional, that we're full of emotions and that we're trying to discern what's going on in the physician's head as well. All right, well, I have promised that I would take your questions, so you can start coming to the mic to ask your questions. Remember, you're going to be recorded, but please do come along. And while we wait for you to come up with your questions, I want to ask a question that people often ask me about you, since we've worked together for so long, which is, how do you do all this? How do you balance the fact that you have a clinical life, you have a creative life, which is primarily writing, but also playing the cello, and of course you have a very active family life with 3 children, all at home, and
You left out the aging dog.
I forgot the dog. I was going to mention the aging
Deaf
dog.
and limping.
How do you manage to do
I think the first thing is that there never is a balance. That's sort of this, myth that's up there with closure of things that don't actually exist. I mean, really, you cut out from things that are not essential. So, things that I never do in life: go in a store, shop, buy anything, cook anything. I've made a decision that all of that stuff. I mean, my kids can show up in anything, as long as they're wearing clothing when it's sub-zero out. That's good enough for me, and it's okay. But also in clinical life, I spend 3 days in the hospital, and 2 days, I don't set foot in the hospital, short of one of my patients coding. Other than that, I try to protect that time. I never get on a committee. If you need a volunteer for a committee, I excuse myself for a drink of water, I tie my shoelaces, anything to not have more time taken up. So we talked about this earlier, about you have to be a little bit disciplined and a little bit forceful in not taking on extra things, as fun as they may be. And the same thing with music. I love playing the cello. There isn't a whole lot of time, and so in that one precious hour after the kids are in bed and before you collapse, you could exercise for 30 minutes. You could catch up on your journals. You could read those 18th century novels you've been meaning to read. And so I don't do any of those, and then I'll use that one little time, and I'll worry about the exercise, in the next life. So cutting back, but I also want to do what's fun, and try to avoid things that are just not fun. I'm so glad that some of my colleagues love administrative work, because I'll let them do it if they find it fun, and I really want to spend my time in the hospital with my patients, and then try to carve out a little bit of time with nothing else going on.
It's quite a juggling act, though, because there are so many pieces. And in fact, at dinner, we were talking with some medical students who are also studying or simultaneously working on an MBA, which I found really breathtaking. I mean, I can imagine how hard it is to be a medical student, to be a resident, and also to be pursuing another degree simultaneously, one that would be, but you, of course, also did a PhD at the same time that you were going through your medical training.
I did, and people often ask if it was English literature, which I think if I knew then what I know now might have been, but it was biochemistry, and which I loved, and it was a wonderful, I didn't stay in the lab, but I wouldn't change it for anything. I mean, it gives you this sort of skepticism about everything, from Medicare to clinical trials to what your kids come home with. I'm skeptical of everything, but sometimes the overlap can be nice. Editing a literary journal, we have lots of poets who tend to be uninsured or underinsured, and also hypochondriacal. And so once they get the catch, their editors are also doctors. This is great, and so they're constantly calling with their various and sundry aches and this. You don't get this, Helen, from your editing, but we at the BLR are writers constantly referral to someone. Where can I find a dermatologist? And it's also really fun that you can pull these things together.
Yeah, talk about, we haven't even touched on that whole role of your eighth life as the editor of the BLR. Talk a little bit about doing that.
So the Bellevue Literary Review came up a little bit happenstance. I think most things came upon happenstance, but after I'd taken some time away from medicine and started writing the stories, when I came back to Bellevue as an attending, one of the things I had to do is, when I have students in my clinic, I have to grade their write-ups. They write these history and physicals, which after you've read the first 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or 100, they're all kind of the same, and really this very dull clinical language that gets old fast. And I remember by the 100th one, I just said, can you please just write the patient's story, drop the jargon, just tell me, what's it like for the patient to have their disease? And the students started writing these incredible stories, of their patients that were fascinating to read. And I was sort of gathering quite a collection of great student stories. And at the same time, we had a new chair of medicine, Martin Blazer, who was asking students to write an essay on anything in medicine. And someone said, you ought to meet. And we thought about maybe a student journal. But as we talked more, I think we realized that it's, there's a universal, concern. You can go through life and, not need a plumber, conceivably, or an accountant, but you can't go through life and not touch in with the medical world, either yourself, your parent, your child. So we're all, a little nervous and scared about this other world. So we decided to open a journal up to the general public. We took out a couple of ads in writing journals, and I'll tell you, we had 1,000 submissions, in just a few weeks. People just had lots to write, and some were nurses and doctors, and lots were patients, and others were just writers who thought about this. And so it's taken on a life of its own, that we get 4,000 submissions a year. People have a lot to say and think about this. And I've learned so much from reading all these submissions. And We also have twice yearly readings at Bellevue Hospital. I mean, who would have thunk? Bellevue Hospital, place to come for poetry. But now we've had 25 readings there. We have 100 people, standing room only. And we always say it's the safest. If you're ever going to have a heart attack at a poetry reading, this is the place to do it.
And you often can have a heart attack because the poetry can be heart-stopping, of course.
Certainly. I mean, we have had some of the most incredible, powerful experiences that come. And people now associate Bellevue, amongst other things, now as a place for fiction, poetry, and nonfiction.
Now, I can keep asking Danielle questions because I have hours and hours of questions to ask, but we are here to hear your questions, so please come up to the mic.
Thanks so much for this opportunity, and thank you for sharing your writing and your thoughts with us. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm a psychiatry resident in town, and I can definitely relate to emotions participating in my experience and my practice with patients, both mine and theirs. I wonder, you mentioned your year that you took off after residency before you started writing. And I wonder if you've had any time since then where you had writer's block, where the emotional valence kind of got in the way of your ability to express yourself.
Interesting. Writer's block. I went to my first, thank you for that great question, writer's conference, in fact, in that year off. And the keynote speaker was talking about writer's block and was outlining increasingly contorted strategies to activate the muse. And I'm in the back thinking, just come to Bellevue, man. I feel as though we in medicine, inspiration walks by all the time. And of course, I want to caution against feeling exploitative of our patients' stories, but I certainly always feel inspired by the parade of humanity. And I think I have friends who sit in cubicles or who work with spreadsheets, and I just think, thank God I'm not there. It's such a privilege to be front and center in humanity. And I would say if I feel a writer's block, then I want to turn to fiction because fiction is free. In nonfiction, you have a certain duty to fidelity, and you want to respect that. But if you get to, escape to fiction or poetry, you can do whatever you want. And that's really, really exciting. And often, if a story feels blocked, it's often time to put it under the bed and then come back a year later. And you'd be surprised when you go back to it, you see different things. And then there's the great function of an editor who can then look at it and say, let's recast this way. Let's tear out this page or put this here. And then a new story comes to life. So I can't speak highly enough of having an editor to, I know that self-publishing is a wonderful thing for many people, but, not having the experience of a real editor, you miss out something in the genesis of your writing that is really a worthwhile experience.
Dr. Ofri, this was a great talk. My name is Haider. I'm one of the residents in BI. So I liked your comment about medicine as art. One of my, in my other areas of interest, I also am interested in research, and I feel like medicine has been an art for thousands of years. It's only recently become a science. And before ACLS, what we used to do for patients who coded was we would open their chests and massage their heart with our hands, or even before that, we would insufflate their rectums with smoke. At this point, there's such a great challenge between finding what's the right balance between medicine as science versus art. And what do you think is that right balance? And is there a way to quantify the intangible aspects of medicine that we practice?
So what is the balance of the science and art of medicine? I think so happily it's not a trade-off. And what I love about being a doctor, being in medicine, is that you have both. And you have tools to help patients, tangible tools that can give help. We have medicines that work and technologies, and many that don't, but we do have things, and we can bring in the art of medicine as well. And I think that, 100 years ago, when a patient coded, we held their hand and then called in the priest. That's really what we did, and now we have other things too. We still want to hold our patient's hand and bring in a spiritual person as well, but we also have things to do. So I love that we can do both and not relegated to one or the other, and that's, I think, what makes it a wonderful field to be in. I think it helps us to be cognizant of, often technology has this sort of lure of the being exact and correct and being better in many ways. And most of that, I think, as we move on in our careers, that a lot of that is a facade. It's a great tool, but we've seen cases where technology sort of takes over the care of a patient, almost always the patient is the worse off for that. And the really, the difference between being smart and then having wisdom, I think, is what takes us from the, great high tech of medicine to the great art of medicine, using the technology, in service of that, but not letting it take over. I every time I see that happen, almost always the patient, is worse for the wear.
Good evening. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. My name is Lippy Roy. I'm an internist at Boston Healthcare for the Homeless Program and at Mass General. So as you can imagine, I'm privileged to hear stories all the time, just fascinating stories. And it's a real challenge, but also a highly rewarding job to have. So one of my questions is, what kind of advice would you give to people who are doctors who are trying to really write about these fascinating stories? So far, I'll email myself little blurbs of these fascinating stories that I hear, whether it be of substance abuse, depression, homeless veterans, you name it. I feel like I'm very fortunate to hear these stories, but my goal is to maybe start writing some articles and eventually maybe like one day a book. But what kind of advice would you give to writers?
So what advice for people who want to write, who are in the medical profession? Well, there are a couple of things. One is that I would definitely advise people to take a writing class. I think there's lots of craft to learn. We assume that, Jane Austen woke up and was Jane Austen, and maybe she was, but I think the rest of us have had things to learn. I think we can always improve. And for me, some writing classes in the beginning were extremely helpful. There's a lot of craft that can make whatever writing you have much, much, much better. And when we get submissions at the BLR, I can see the difference. People, will write about an interesting thing that happened, doesn't make it compelling reading. There's a huge gap in there. And I think, we're now lucky to have such a preponderance of MFA programs and writing classes, for the unaffiliated that can help us. So that's one thing, is, there's a lot to learn about writing. And then you might want to think about why one is writing. And there's many reasons why you can do it. Publication's only one of them. I mean, people often write just for the experience of writing. And then you might want to think about what's the impact for the patients. I mean, ideally, we would like consent from our patients. It's their story. Sometimes it's not possible, or sometimes it might not be the right thing. So my advice is you can write about whatever you want. Whether you publish is a different story. You might decide, for this patient, what if they ran across this, would they find that harmful? Would it be insulting? Would it be hurtful? And are the duties are not equivalent of writer and caregiver. I mean, really, you're a doctor first, and that's the primary thing. So if writing would somehow harm the patient, then it's not something that you need to publish, but you can still write about it. Now, some people like Rita Sharon at Columbia will share the work with the patient as part of the therapeutic process, and the patients will correct the story. And there's a whole other way that some people use writing, or may use it with their colleagues as a way. I mean, certainly there's programs in oncology that use a lot of storytelling with the nursing staff and the medical staff to, give voice to some of the intense emotions they're having. Finding a writing group, a writing partner is very helpful, a mentor. And then often if you feel like the patient might be harmed by that, then there's always fiction. A lot of us have taken interesting stories and cases and people we meet and turn them around, and you can use them for fiction, and the world's your oyster on that.
In fact, you tell two different stories. They may even be in two different books. I'd have to recollect it. But about patients where you had a lot of qualms about writing their stories, but also where having their stories articulated really made a huge difference in the way that you were able to care for them, and also the way the medical students were able to perceive them. And I'm thinking specifically of a man who came in such poor condition that no one could see his humanity, because no one knew who was behind this very desiccated body. And it wasn't until it was his wife, I think, who arrived and talked to him. Mr. Easton. That's a great story.
This was a patient. I remember the resident came to me. The patient came to me and said, "This patient's condition is not compatible with life."
The resident.
The resident reported this about the patient. that's a pretty strong statement. And the patient was admitted with skin ulcers, right? That was it, D-cube ulcers, not compatible with life. What could this possibly be? I mean, I've seen a lot of the ulcers in my day, and so I went over, and I have never seen ulcers, I mean, filleted from tip to toe. It was shocking. There was really nothing left of this man. I mean, really, you could see the skeleton was horrifying. And he had some amount of cognitive impairment for unclear reasons. And it was so uncomfortable. Ultimately, he had a bilateral amputation, disarticulation, he lost both limbs. I mean, there really was so little left of him, and it was so hard to be with him or imagine him as a person. And then somewhere along the line, like, his wife turned up. Like, and it was hard to imagine this person had family and this lively and, person full of energy, and the stories about him, and he was a preacher, and it so changed how we viewed him once this other person came in. And I mean, because he really did feel like a corpse. We really couldn't talk with him. You could hardly examine him. There wasn't anything to examine. And it was a tragic case. But once his wife came in and created him it really changed how all of us could be in the room and be with him. And he became this person through her. And it made me realize that, we were so focused on the physicality of this person, which was so horribly impaired, that we couldn't imagine there was more to him than the physical part. And, luckily for us, his wife showed up, and it makes me think about what happened to us if we ended up in a condition where we ourselves couldn't come through and just some shell of us was there. How awful would that be? And so the person's story and life entirely changed how we were able to care for this tragic man.
Hi, my name is Vidya, and I'm a post-bac pre-med student. And so being a post-bac, like having studied something different in college, never been pre-med before, I have a lot of friends who also have diverse backgrounds before choosing to go into medicine. And it was really gratifying to read your book, because the thing we worry about is not necessarily the academic side. We've made an intentional decision to pursue that. What we worry about is the burnout and the emotional side. And I wonder if you, looking back on medical school or working with med students now, if you have any recommendations or ideas about how can aspiring doctors work or kind of conduct themselves in ways that prevent the burnout that so many people are writing about these days.
Thank you for that question about burnout. And it really feels like an epidemic, a burnout. Now, burnout's always been with us, but it feels somehow that it's more these days. And it's interesting that you talk about having prior interests. And I was talking with a group this morning, what's the most recent book you've read? And some people couldn't name one, because in our lives we don't have time to read books for pleasure. Or what's your hobby? And I ask students that all the time, and they'll talk wistfully about, books they used to read and things they used to love, and like layers of an onion, it just peels away over the course of our career. It's gone. By the time you become the certified doctor, everything that was you is, it's like you shed those skins like a snake. And so I think that stitching a little bit of that back into our current lives, that although it's very busy and very intense, studying, 5 or 10 minutes less in the day, but 5 or 10 minutes of what's meaningful for you, painting, writing, reading, dance, will make a huge difference. And because I think that keeps us who we are. The same way with Mr. Easton, we lost who he was. His wife brought it back, and I think it's incumbent upon us to keep some of that in there. So that's one thing I find on a personal level. And the second is to find the mentor who not everyone has, succumbed to the system. There are plenty of people out there who have satisfying lives in medicine and do balance things, and seek them out, and they will help you through, I promise you. Yes.
Hi, good evening. I'm a recent student who just graduated from undergraduate. I was wondering more about kind of focusing on reforming med school or reforming residency programs in a way to incorporate having outlets to write or better ways of coping, so that way med students and residents focus also on their mental health. That way they can provide better quality care. Do you think there is room for that, or there's a possibility to reform that system? And if you do, like, how would you go about that?
Great question about whether we can bring some of this into the official curriculum. Medical school curricula are undergoing vast changes, as we speak, changing 4 years to 3 years and preclinical to 18 months and longitudinal clerkships, many, many changes that have a lot of potential. I think we've realized that the days of learning every fact and then, are gone. The factual base is simply beyond us, and let's concede that our computers do it better and not, I think, waste precious time memorizing what you can look up. I mean, I don't do it from memory. I don't think anyone does. We rely on these databases. Instead, can we use our time for learning the skills of doctoring or the skills of nursing and the skills that make us connect with patients? And I think we're recognizing that these artistic outlets are part of that. And so many schools do have either required electives where you can choose what you want or some kind of focus or concentration. I just spent some time today at Cambridge Hospital, which now has a integrated clerkship, and part of that is writing and taking time to be with your patients, over the course of a year, and really seeing their story. Even if you don't write it down per se, you're having a chance to participate. You are part of that story. You're a character in their drama, and living that story with them, I think, gives you something to live for with them. That's very different than seeing a patient, in and out, and then they're just another, number on your page. So I think there is hope. Medicine's slow to change. I mean, we're not the progressive field where we're a little, archaic in many ways, but we're getting there slowly. And part of it will change when you are there. You'll help be that change that, makes it different.
Well, I wanted to ask you, would you say that writing, playing the cello, your exposure to the arts has changed the kind of doctor you are? And if so, how?
I took up cello kind of late in life when I turned 40. So it wasn't a part of my, earlier life. But I realized for me that what I had been missing, and I think what a lot of burnout comes in mid-career, is that once you've gotten over the hump of learning to be a doctor, it doesn't change that much after that. Year 7 and year 11, and year 13 and year 6 are roughly the same. I mean, diabetes and hypertension, they don't change a whole heck of a lot over the course of a decade or two. And after that intense focus of medical school and residency of learning so much on the steep curve, it really does flatten out. And I think many doctors mid-career do find somewhat of a lapse. And for me, starting music lessons at that time, it was like being back on that path again. All of a sudden, I was being challenged in that way that I really hadn't been in medicine. I was still learning a bit, but not the way it was with the music teacher who really forced you to push your limit. And then, every week I have to show up and I'd have to show something for my week. And so it pushed me in a way that I hadn't been. And that intellectual challenge and those puzzles to work out, I think kind of reawakened some deadened neurons. It made it easier to then be in medicine, that the brain was still churning a little bit as opposed to atrophying. So I find that to be very helpful just on a personal level. I mean, but I do think, particularly literature and poetry and fiction, you're stuck in the airport and your plane's letting you go grab a book. You instantly know, like the airport novel from the great literature. You open, you read the first page, and you know the difference. And the difference is usually, and maybe you can't articulate that, but the writer in a great novel, captures the character and voice of that patient in a way, of that character that is so alive and so unique as opposed to a generic, genre kind of character. And that's a great skill for people in medicine. Paying attention to the details of what makes, one patient different from another, one pneumonia different from another, I think is what you do in writing, in good literature. You really look for those unique and individual details that make this character stand out from that one. So I think there is a lot to be learned from writing. And we talked a lot before about poetry. And I mean, poetry is all about metaphor. And I often think that our patients speak to us in metaphor. They'll come with a list of issues and concerns, but it's a metaphor for what's happening in their life, and it's our job, it's our duty to unravel their metaphors. And where better to practice that skill than in reading or writing poetry? You don't get metaphorical practice, in medical school, but you need that to be a skilled clinician. And I think it's not just to make yourself feel happy, but to be a better diagnostician.
I know an example of a place where thinking that way, thinking about the importance of narrative and storytelling, really made a huge difference. This is another kind of Mr. Easton story, but quite different. And that was a story of when you took some medical students around to interview an alcoholic patient who was on his 14th admission to the hospital.
57th admission.
57th. Right. And you were all looking at this patient as, well, here he is on his 57th admission to the hospital for the same problem, really what is there to say or do? But then you had the inspiration to ask him this amazing question. Do you think you could find that passage?
Or I can just
tell
summarize
the
it.
story.
We have a lot of alcohol and drug issues, and I think when we talk about empathy with patients, it's easy to empathize with someone who broke their leg and is in pain. That makes sense. But it's very hard to empathize with people who have what appear to be self-inflicted illnesses. Drug use, alcohol, obesity, HIV. We have a lot of trouble as a profession summoning up because we think, well, we wouldn't have gotten ourselves there, even though we certainly do in many respects, but we feel a lot of moral superiority, and so we hate those patients make us angry, and they keep coming back, and they keep going back to their drugs, and it's just not nihilistic. And often the house staff, they copy and paste the admission from the 56th admission, because it doesn't change. It's exactly the same. And they go to rehab, or they don't go to rehab, and they just go back to using. And so I took a team there, and the rounds were disastrous. The patient just grunting one-word answers, and all these blackouts, who knows what happened. So I was thinking, well, how can I rescue these rounds? So I thought of a question that came to me. I hadn't thought of it before, and I asked him, could you tell us the precise moment when you knew you were addicted? Because, we never see the moment that an illness starts. We're there when you're healthy to check up, and we're there when you're sick, but we never see that transition point. That's almost always in private, and we're never party to that exact transition point. And this guy, disheveled kind of street guy says, yeah, there was an exact moment. I can tell you that. He said, I was driving up the Henry Hudson Parkway, the West Side Highway in Manhattan, going to my favorite nephew for his birthday barbecue, and it was a beautiful spring day, and the trees were in bloom. And all of a sudden, I needed a hit. And I wanted it. I wanted it more than anything. And that desire, I wanted it more than seeing my favorite nephew, than having this day out. And I remember turning the car around 158th Street, just flipping around and going downtown back to my dealer. And I knew at that moment that I was addicted. And it was like, and he made this quote, God reached out a finger and flicked the car the other direction, and I've been heading downtown ever since. And it was pin drop silent after that. The specificity of his description was so powerful. And I think for all of us in the room, we must have been 14 people crammed in the room, I had never really ever thought what it might be like to be that frequent flyer alcoholic or drug addict, because it was so far from our experience. But the way he described it, the feeling of these inexorable forces overpowering and turning the car around against his will, evoked such a strong reaction. I think for the first time, we could imagine what it might feel like, and what is that if not empathy, that we could really imagine what it was like. And I wouldn't kid myself that we would instantly, overnight, cure his, drug addiction by our wonderful, inspiration. But it's hard to imagine how you'd ever have a chance without that. That would begin, and it changed the dynamics. The rest of the month, he was on the ward. We went in his room more. There was no eye rolling. He was much nicer with us. We were much happier with him. It definitely changed the dynamic. So I think that, and he became this real, live, three-dimensional person, not just that drug addict on his 57th admission.
Please.
Hi, my name is Arlene. I'm a nurse, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to patients. My question to you is, you somewhat answered it right now, but is about the whole process of healing. Patients, have you found that patients heal in a better way if you find that they're heard and they're listened to? And if they're not, if you don't write about them, what happens to a lot of these people that you're not really dealing with? So versus writing and not writing in the healing process.
Well, it's a tough question to answer because you only ultimately write about a few patients given, an in-practice clinician, sees hundreds and thousands of patients. So, and all those, who knows how many, cholesterol medication adjustments, I've done this past year that I don't write about, and other things that maybe I miss. So I can't quite do the controlled trial on that. And I'll have to say, I can't say if the writing itself is at all healing. And that to me would be a little bit much of a stretch. I mean, there's certainly part of it for me, and maybe it makes me a better doctor for them. I hope so, but I can't say that for sure. But I think it just more reminds me to be the better listener. And while I never think about writing while I'm in clinic, I think that the skills you hone as a writer of paying attention to detail and specifics, and this gentleman's story was so specific about that, and so that would never end up in the HPI and in the medical record. But the specificity of how a patient looks, how they walk, it's fascinating. And I think it just keeps our eyes open a little bit more. So I can't say whether it heals more, but I think it keeps our eyes, more open. And I think it's ultimately better for both of us. Can't prove it, but I'm hopefully it isn't doing any harm.
Good evening. I'm a retired physician who burned out after 20 years of intensive care and then ran hospitals for another 20 years. And my concern is less about physicians who burn out and more about physicians who don't care. And I've always been struck that there's this urge to pace yourself, don't get too involved, don't get overly emotionally involved with your patients. And yet I'm really much more concerned, maybe because I'm at the patient end now, about this sort of built-in telescope effect. The physician, for you, for the patient, you're gigantic, because they've only got one doctor that day anyway. But for the doctor, they're pretty small when you look through the other end of the telescope, because you've got 30 people waiting in clinic or 25 people to round on. So I worry much more about the physician who keeps him or herself back, who doesn't make the emotional investment and may not care enough. What do you think about those issues?
I think it's our job as educators to head that off at the pass. It's hard to say I can do much about, the late career physician who is, completely walled off. But I think we do have an effect on the generations that we are training. And the idea that the teaching is really not what happens in the classroom or with the PowerPoint presentation, but how they see you on the wards and what you're doing. And I think demonstrating it in real time, like with this drug addict patient, it was the medical students and the house staff, hate these patients, and I hate them too. But for the first time, we didn't. It actually became, dare I say, pleasurable. It became not onerous, and it became easier after that. And I think that is the way that we can demonstrate, walking the walk of what you can gain from that, and how much easier it is to deal with a difficult patient when you make that investment, and that it doesn't necessarily have to overwhelm you. You're not necessarily opening the floodgates and being paralyzed by this, and that does happen occasionally, and hopefully you have more senior mentors who can help when that happens. But I think you can see that life is actually better, and it's more fun and less boring when you find out what it is that makes that person tick. Otherwise, it could be very boring. You're right.
I want to ask you, because we were just talking about healing, and that's ultimately what medicine is about, or at least we hope so. Or do you want to ask one more question, Pat? Because I was going to ask Danielle to wrap up with something, but please.
Okay, well then, let me ask you a question, Helen. Danielle has said she's a doctor first, and then she writes. What is it like for you as an editor to work with a writer who is a doctor first, as opposed to a writer who is a poet first or a novelist first? How does that balance affect your work?
It's completely fascinating. I learn a lot. I'm always engrossed by the stories that Danielle is telling, by her observations. It's so unique, it's so different. But then I'm an editor almost exclusively of nonfiction. So many of my authors walk other walks, do other things, and they're writing about subjects that are intrinsically fascinating to me. But I have to say that medicine is of particular fascination, I think, to many of us outside the field, and knowing how medicine works, and especially what makes doctors tick. And this last book, What Doctors Feel, which is especially getting inside the emotional life of doctors, was particularly engrossing for me. So I think it's what you were just saying. You can enjoy your work, and I really enjoy working with Danielle on these books because I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly engrossed by the stories, and it's a real pleasure sometimes to be able to ask her a question to clarify something, and the piece becomes richer and better because there was something I saw as a lay reader that needed to be spun out a little bit more, or whatever. So that's very rewarding for me. And Danielle, of course, does that too, as in one of her other roles as an editor, helping people improve their writing.
I think it's one of the most fun things. It actually has a lot in parallel, I think, with being a medical educator, is, seeing a medical student become a doctor and seeing a piece come from a little bit of a diamond in the rough to be coming together and getting published and recognized. It's wonderful to be part of that creation. It's really, it's super fun. What can I say?
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, since there are no more questions, I do want to get back to that subject of healing and ask you if you would read the end of What Doctors Feel, which is about that whole subject of healing.
Okay. Doctors often don't get the distinction between curing and healing, but patients instinctively do. For most doctors, if the disease has been eradicated, well, that's success. For patients, that's only part of the process. A significant one, obviously, but not the only one. Plenty of patients walk out of our hospitals, clinics, and offices with their diseases under control, and yet they do not feel healed. Paying attention to the emotions within the doctor-patient or any caregiver-patient interaction doesn't guarantee healing, no doubt, but ignoring them surely makes it less likely. Healing is a matter of time, wrote Hippocrates, but it is sometimes also a matter of opportunity. Taking this opportunity can be prescriptive for both doctors and patients. 36 years after Sir William Osler's famous Equanimitas speech about the distance that doctors and patients need, Dr. Francis Peabody gave another commencement address to another graduating class of eager medical students. He summed up his ideas in this now famous phrase: "The secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient." It's a deceptively simple axiom, one that encompasses compassion, empathy, and human connection, along with all the medical technologies and therapeutic modalities that a caregiver can offer to a patient. Beyond curing, this is what offers the possibility of healing.